Hello and welcome back. This is the week 4 lecture. So today I would like to continue to work with some of these strategies for analysis that we've spent the last few weeks on. We're going to shift gears a little bit next week as we move into close reading. That's going to be a little bit different. And then after 2 weeks spent with close reading, we move into literary criticism and theory. Thinking a little bit more about how to use critical or theoretical lenses to examine some of these texts, entering into larger critical conversations. So we're getting into all of that stuff a little bit later, but this week I would like to sort of wrap up some of these general strategies that we've been going through. So we've been tackling a few different ones each week. We have a few new strategies for this week. So we're going to talk about context, we're going to talk about genre, and then social relevance. So those are our new tools, our new methods or strategies that we can use to generate original analysis. But I would also like to go back to a couple of strategies that I mentioned last week. Conflict and change. We really haven't talked very much about those yet. I brought them up. I encouraged you to look for them in the week 3 texts. So now I would like to go back to those 2 short stories that we read in week 3. Let's talk about them. Let's run them through some of these strategies, both the ones that I mentioned last week and the ones that we're getting into this week, just to see some additional ways that we can find stuff, identify interesting elements, features, devices, and then generate some original ideas about them. Last week, back in week 3, we read Where Are You Going? Where Have You Been? By Joyce Carol Oates. That was published in 1966. And we also read A Good Man is Hard to Find by Flannery O'Connor from 1955. So these are both very famous American short stories from the same general era, although the 50s and 60s were quite different. And the time periods will matter, settings will matter as we think a little bit more about these texts and some of these new strategies that we're working with this week. So maybe some of you guys have had experience with these authors or even with these texts. A lot of O'Connor short stories used to be taught in the high school level, in other undergrad classes. They're typically, she's often anthologized and thought to be a real master practitioner of the short story form. And Joyce Carol Oates is also a very well-known author who's had a very long career spanning pretty much the entire second half of the 20th century into the 21st. So if you're familiar, great. It's always good to revisit some of these texts. If this is your first time reading these, that's great too. Both texts are pretty disturbing, but they're both also held up as great examples of just the short story form and what it can achieve in a relatively small package. So let's start with the Oates text, and again, we'll run it through conflict, change, but we'll also talk about it in relation to context, genre, and larger social relevance. And then after we do that sort of together right here, or after I walk us through that here in lecture, I would like you guys to maybe go to the O'Connor text and do the same thing. Run it through these same basic strategies. See what you come up with. So let's start with Where Are You Going? Where Have You Been? I will say a few things about A Good Man is Hard to Find, particularly about genre, just to sort of clue you guys into a few key concepts and things to maybe look up or look into if you ever want to do more work with that story. But for now, let's go to Oates and let's talk about conflict and Where Are You Going? Where have you been? So there's some pretty obvious, almost surface level conflict that we can identify. Of course, we're looking at a lot of interpersonal conflict here, but not all of the conflicts or sources of tension on display are necessarily one person versus another person. But we can certainly see some conflicts like that. And in my notes, I hope you guys are annotating and taking notes as you read and maybe keeping up with those reading journals that we've mentioned. But one thing I wrote down is one of the first conflicts that we notice really early in the story is Connie, our protagonist, versus her mother. So this is a conflict that gets sort of pointed out to us by our narrator very early in the text, and there's some nuance to it. It's complex, but we notice it, and there were a couple of lines I underlined, things that we might jot down or have some commentary for later, but just a few lines that seem to drive home some important details about this conflict. One was, this is kind of picking up mid-sentence here, but now her looks were gone. And that was why she was always after Connie, referencing the mom in that case. Another line that I thought was good, sometimes over coffee, they were almost friends. But something would come up, some vexation that was like a fly buzzing suddenly around their heads, and their faces went hard with contempt. So not only is that just really good descriptive sort of passage, we get a really nice simile, we get a good description of facial expression, but we get this sense that there is common ground, there is some affection. At some point later in the text, we even hear Connie's suspicion that her mom actually prefers her, but feels like she needs to be harder on her. She's often compared to her older sister, June, who lives at home, is very steady, has a job, and is stable, but at least in Connie's mind is maybe kind of lame because she's 24 and still lives at home. So there's clearly a conflict between Connie and her mom, and we might think of it as a somewhat typical conflict that often exists between mothers and daughters. Some might be able to relate to it, or maybe we've seen a similar type relationship depicted in movies or other works of fiction. So that's obviously one conflict that seems worth considering. But even as that conflict is being described, we're perhaps getting access, or we're getting a glimpse at a larger conflict that's existing between Connie and the rest of her nuclear family, because she doesn't seem to have maybe the best relationship with her dad or her sister either. And she seems to have some negative opinions about her sister. We don't learn very much about the dad other than the fact that he comes home from work and he just wants supper and he reads the paper and he does not really talk to his family. And then after supper, he goes to bed. So he seems a little absentee. Doesn't seem like she necessarily is the biggest fan of her sister, although again, we don't get a ton of insight into their relationship, their inner workings, but there just seems to be friction. She seems to feel a little bit alienated, a little bit separate from the rest of her family, and that sort of gets manifested in a very real, very direct way, and a very significant way if we're just thinking about sort of the plot of the story. The fact that she is alone when Arnold shows up at the house, the fact that she chose not to go to the cookout, she did not want to go with the other members of her family. And of course, this is understandable. We know that she's a teenager. We know that she's in high school. So a lot of this might not strike us as unusual or abnormal conflict, and that's fine. We might view a lot of this as sort of typical teenage rebellion on Connie's part. I know when I was a teenager, I didn't really want to hang out with my parents and my older sibling very much. So again, we can certainly relate, and Connie doesn't strike me as a, especially, terrible or just beyond the pale type character. This is, pretty typical for the age and for that station in life, but it's still conflict. It's conflict that perhaps drives decision making. It's conflict that perhaps helps to shape sort of Connie's perception, her sort of conception of herself, her own self-image. So we can think about a larger conflict that maybe exists between her and the other members of her family. She feels a little separate, a little different, and then later she is separated from them. She is isolated in a way that kind of ultimately makes her vulnerable to a predator like Arnold. So we can talk more about that. So those are some conflicts we can explore. But thinking in sort of larger terms, we might also think about sort of a conflict between youth culture and adult culture. That's another thing we can sort of track throughout the text, that's maybe part of the tension between Connie and her mom. We hear her mom reference Connie's trashy daydreams, or, the junk she puts in her hair. There's an obvious sort of distinction between what Connie likes, values, thinks is interesting and cool versus what adults value and what adults sort of prioritize. So again, this is very common. Like, I think if anybody can probably think back to their teen years, and yeah, you often feel misunderstood, perhaps. You don't feel like the adults in your life understand your interests. They don't understand the music that you like, maybe. They don't understand your fashion sense. They don't understand, other sort of cultural tastes. Typically, kids will like different sort of cultural productions, compared to their parents, or compared to maybe even older siblings. So again, there's several moments in the text where you just sort of get this sort of sense of general disapproval of the youth and sort of what the youth are doing. Again, a lot of this sort of is given utterance by her mom. At one point, again, these are just sort of like snippets that they're not always really pursued all that much, but they say a lot. At one point, the mom asks, what's this about the Pettinger girl? Some friend of Connie who's gotten in trouble or, done something that's, drawn the disapproval of adults. And we learn that Connie tries to sort of draw a distinction between her and other kids who might get in trouble or might earn parental, reprimands or whatever. But I think we can get the feeling that, she probably is similar to a lot of her friends. She's a part of this sort of larger youth culture that we get a glimpse of when she's sort of out with her girlfriend. They get dropped off. They go to a sort of a diner. They meet up with boys, sort of pretend to, be just going to the movies, but they sort of have other intentions. And again, it's sort of secret, right? It's sort of private. We get another really key line, I think. Everything about her had describing Connie, everything about her had two sides to it. One for home and one for anywhere that was not home. So this idea of a hidden life, again, this is sort of a trope, right? I mean, if you've ever watched, dramas centered around teens, stuff that might have maybe a little bit of a young adult audience, this is often sort of an idea that gets pursued, right? That young people, teenagers, they sort of have a hidden life, a separate life, a life that adults maybe wouldn't really understand, or adults just don't see it. They don't notice it because it's often being sort of played out in these covert ways. So we see that here. And we see sort of distinctions between young people and older people. We see how Connie, feels very alive. She feels very sort of this sense of exhilaration when she's out with friends, when she's the subject of attention at times. But that gets very complicated as the text progresses. But we can sort of, we notice that, her private life, her social life is very separate and very distinct from her home life. And if anything, it seems like she perhaps derives more sort of satisfaction or happiness, at least at this juncture of her life, from, the music and the dates and the friends and the social life, that private teenage life that is kept very separate from her family. So all of those can be viewed as sources of conflict, tension. And then, of course, when Arnold shows up, we get very palpable, very real conflict that's, again, very suspenseful, but then ultimately horrifying, disturbing. And especially, we can interpret the ending a few different ways, but it certainly doesn't seem like she's ultimately going to be able to fend him off or escape him. So that's a very real conflict that, consumes much of the second half of the narrative. But, we might sort of wonder, what were some of the circumstances or some of the conditions necessary to create that kind of a conflict. So we have to think more about the Arnold character, and I think we also have to think a little bit more about youth culture. So if we move to change, I just want to cover this one kind of quickly because I really want to get to context. I think this story gives us a lot to work with when it comes to social context. But again, just as a way to spark analysis, you should always identify key moments of change. Like, where are the shifts or transitions in the narrative. And this can be changes that are mostly centered on characters, larger changes that might be evident, but you should always track those because those are always important and those will always yield more material if you think about them more. So we might notice a transition here sort of from safety to danger. Does it feel like Connie is safe early in the narrative? And then, of course, by the end, do we realize that she's very much like, isolated, alone, and in danger? So is that one transition that we can track? Are we tracking a transition from childhood to something else? Is there some kind of a loss of innocence, a sort of twisted, disturbing coming of age, which is a very familiar type of narrative that we've all seen before. Stories that are really about young people growing up and having the sorts of experiences that help you become an adult. But the experience that Connie's having here seems far more awful, terrifying, and sort of earth-shattering. So we have to, but it is a transition. She's going from one state to another. Some people almost detect a shift from sort of like fantasy to reality. Like maybe at times Connie is living in a sort of fantasy world, largely fueled by youth culture, the music, the cars, the clothes, the friends, the social life, and then she's sort of very, abruptly and rudely ushered into reality by the story's end. The fantasy or the dream is sort of ended, is sort of killed, and harsh reality sets in. Some people view it that way, but just look for the change. Where does the change occur? What changes are we seeing? And what are, what is the larger significance of those changes? But now let's get to context, because we can definitely do work with social context here. And this is something that we know by now. With a lot of literature, whether it's short stories, poetry, novels, drama, we often want to look into certain aspects of the larger context. That just means sort of everything that surrounds the text. Certain aspects of the time and place, either that text was produced in or that text is depicting. Because sometimes we might want to pick one or the other. We might need to learn, if we're reading historical fiction, we might need to know a little bit about the historical period that particular text is depicting. But in other cases, we might need to know a little bit about the time and the place where that text came out of. Think a little bit more about what was going on during the time that piece was written and published. And that really yields a lot of good results here with this story. And if anybody Googled it or looked into it a little bit, you've probably already seen a lot of this information. But we can go back to the year of publication, 1966. We know that the 60s were a decade of great upheaval and tumult in the U.S. The Vietnam War, a lot of social movement, civil rights, increasing pushes for, women's rights, rights for the LGBTQ community. So a lot of upheaval, a lot of demonstrations, protests, violence, but also a lot of change, social change. So we kind of know that already. We don't need to rehash all of it, but just keep that in mind. This is very much sort of a product of the 60s and a lot of the currents that were present at that time. So if you looked into it a little bit, this might even be on the first page of the text in your book, but Oates dedicates the story to Bob Dylan, who's a musician that most of us are at least somewhat familiar with, even if you don't necessarily have to like his music. But I would recommend, whether you're a fan of his or not, I would recommend that you listen to one of his songs in particular, because it's supposed to have inspired Oates to write this story. So if you want to check it out, it's called It's All Over Now, Baby Blue. And the sort of legend is that Oates heard that song, was already kind of a Dylan fan, but heard that song, It's All Over Now, Baby Blue, and sort of just got the idea to write this story. But it's a little more complicated than that. The origin story is a little bit more complicated. There was another big inspiration that helped to create this narrative. It wasn't just the Bob Dylan song, But we should ask ourselves, why is she dedicating the story to Bob Dylan, and what in that particular song? What is it in that particular song that can sort of mirror, what we're seeing in this story? Where are the parallels? We can maybe look for some of those if you go through and listen to the song. You can also find the lyrics online. So again, it's called It's All Over Now, Baby Blue. You might want to read the lyrics, listen to the song. You can find it easily and see if you can find some parallels. So that song matters. The 1960s matter. And then there was another thing that definitely matters when it comes to this story, a real life event that serves at least as a sort of partial basis for the narrative that we see. So I don't want to overstate the importance of this real life sort of sensational murder trial, but we can see some obvious parallels. So again, you might have already found this if you just Googled the story. There's a lot written about this particular angle. So you might be familiar with a serial killer from the 60s named Charles Schmid. And he is sort of the basis for Arnold Friend. And really, we can see a lot of similarities between the two of them. So Schmid was a real-life serial killer in the 1960s in Tucson, Arizona. And I believe he murdered 3 people, all teenage girls. One was his girlfriend, I believe, at the time. And a lot of parallels to Friend. He was no longer in high school. He had previously been sort of a star gymnast, I think, in high school, was sort of popular, had a big circle of friends, but dropped out, was sort of troubled, had a troubled home life, and ended up just sort of working around town, sort of had his own place, but he was a little bit older. But he still had a lot of high school friends, and he still socialized with high school people, as we sort of see from Friend here, when he's sort of hanging out, outside the burger place, and that's when, Connie and he lock eyes. And, so again, sort of similar, Charles Schmid would sort of hang out at all the teenage haunts and continued to cultivate sort of an image as sort of a popular, fun guy, but eventually, turned to murder. But also, as he continued to age, he would do things to make himself seem younger, much like we see from Arnold Friend. So he would wear makeup. Like Arnold, he was short, so he would wear lifts, in his shoes to make him appear taller. He would do things to alter his appearance so he could pass as somebody younger than he actually was. Eventually, one of his friends sort of helped turn him in, and he was apprehended, convicted, was sentenced, I think, originally to death, but then Arizona did away with the death penalty, so his sentence was just changed to a life sentence. He tried to escape. He did escape from prison multiple times, but was always caught and brought back, and eventually was murdered in prison, I believe, during the 70s. Not sure what the source of that conflict was, but he was stabbed by other inmates and later died of his wounds. So we can see clearly Oates, read about this guy, and she's been very open about the influence. There were articles written about Schmid in Life magazine, Time magazine. So he committed his murders over the course of 1964 and 1965. So I think the article, had come out maybe later in 65, some of those articles. So Oates read them, and very soon afterwards she was writing this story. So we can see how Schmid can sort of, serve as the basis for a lot of what we see in Arnold. But perhaps what's most interesting and most terrifying and disturbing about the characters, particularly with Arnold, is as we see him in the short story, is the way he's sort of manipulating or sort of using youth culture as an end, as a way to sort of earn a certain amount of trust or credibility that then gives him, sort of the opportunity to prey upon young people like Connie. So we notice this throughout their extended exchange. It's an extended sequence that really takes up much of, pretty much the entire second half of the story. And as it progresses, we notice more and more about Arnold, with the car, certain slogans and sayings written on the car, the way the car is decorated. again, he's trying to use all of these familiar markers of youth culture, and sort of Connie notices all of them. The way that he's dressed, the jeans, the sort of white pullover, the scuffed boots, is sort of like a very common outfit for high school boys. So he's cultivating that part of the image. The car. He's mentioning music, the radio show that Connie was also listening to. So again, showing that he's like her. Hey, I'm your age. We like the same music. We have a similar sense of style. We like many of the same things. So we can see that it almost works. Initially, Connie is at least a little bit intrigued. I mean, she's wary from the start. She never really comes out of the house to fully sort of accept him, but she is sort of intrigued. She notices some of these markers of youth culture and does sort of approve of them initially, but as the exchange continues and sort of veers more and more into strange, disturbing territory, she starts to notice that he's not what he appears to be. She notices that he's much older than he's claiming to be, and he's obviously wearing makeup. He's wearing, maybe like a wig, and the lifts make it difficult for him to walk in his boots, so he's sort of lurching around. But also we notice that he's not quite sure like what sayings or like lines from songs are still cool. Like she starts to notice that he's just a little bit off. Like he's been watching and observing and imitating, but because he's not young, because he's no longer in high school, it's a little bit difficult for him to keep up. So she notices that one of the slogans on his car was a saying that the kids were like fond of the previous year in school, but they're not really saying it anymore this year. So he's a little out of date. And then as he starts to get frustrated, as she refuses, to come out and get in the car, he starts to sort of rattle off his rapid fire succession. I think he's getting irritated with Ellie in the car, and he starts to just rattle off all of these different sort of catchphrases and slogans, all roughly meaning the same thing, but it's like he's unsure of which one to use, which one is cool, which one is viewed as currently being hip. So Connie's noticing these things, and they start to add up, and she begins to realize that he's really not a peer. He's much older. Ellie is also not a kid. She begins to notice that, and that's really when the story takes on sort of certain like horror characteristics. If we turn to genre in a moment, we might think about some ways to categorize the short story. What would we call it? What do we think it is? And certainly as Arnold's identity becomes more and more clear, it becomes, very similar to a horror story. He's very much monstrous. He's a very grotesque character, and we see grotesque characters in both of these short stories. So that's a term that we'll talk about a little bit here in a moment. But, he's a monstrous villain, and Connie sort of becomes this defenseless victim, unfortunately, who we see so often. That type of character we see so often in horror stories. So clearly, youth culture goes from being sort of this safe space for Connie, a place where she really feels more like herself, or she feels more alive than she does with her own family. It changes. It goes from being that kind of a safe thing, something she could almost depend upon, something that was sort of, struck her as safe and protecting. It transitions and it shifts into something very different when it's being used by Arnold. It becomes sort of distorted and perverted, and it suddenly becomes sort of a tool for evil. And that might be one of the larger lessons that Oates is taking from the Schmid case. Because again, Schmid was this older guy sort of trying to hang on to youth and murdering other teenagers, in an attempt to both exercise his sort of sadistic impulses for control and power. But again, the way he did it was through these sort of markers of cool youth culture, and he cultivated other sort of, accomplices, who would help him sort of cover up some of his crimes. So we get a little bit of, again, Arnold and Ellie seem like sort of a different operation. Charles Schmid had, sort of other friends of his, and they were a bit younger, I think. But again, just similar sort of basic character construction, and they're similar in the sense that they are trying to preserve a certain youthful image, largely so they can prey on other young people. So that's all part of the context. We don't have to pursue every one of those threads, but if we want to have a larger understanding of the short story, it would certainly help if we thought a little bit about the 60s youth culture. If we knew maybe at least a little bit about Charles Schmid. I would argue that it would be sort of important to just think about music in general, popular culture, but especially music, because it gets mentioned so much in the text. We might even notice it as an example of repetition, because Oates repeatedly makes reference to the music and sort of the role popular music played in the lives of young people, namely Connie. So at one point I wrote down this line: the music was always in the background, like music at a church service. It was something to depend upon. So again, this is when Connie is out with her friends, feeling alive, having fun. So again, notice the role the music plays at that point. It's being compared to music at a church service. It was something that she could depend upon. But then later we hear Arnold sort of recycling popular song lyrics. We might even hear an echo to an extent of the Bob Dylan song at the very end when he gets her eye color wrong. But he's starting to use a sort of sing-song, lilting, lyrical quality almost to his lines. And that's another thing. We can notice his speech. It's almost like it's scripted. Right, he has certain like catchphrases and slogans and cool phrasings that he's intentionally trying to use, and Connie can sort of faintly detect that some of these lines sound very much like popular song lyrics, but a lot of those songs blend together. She's listening to music all the time. A lot of the songs were similar in terms of sound and subject matter. So again, if we're thinking about sort of early 60s kind of early rock and roll, or sort of maybe even a little more like doo-wop kind of stuff, but popular music that would have been on the radio. And a lot of social historians will say that this era, the 60s, part of what makes it kind of noteworthy is it's maybe the first time in American history that we have a really well-developed sort of complex youth culture that was really personified largely through music, cars, fashion. It's not that there hadn't been examples of youth culture before, but largely because of advances in technology, cars, radio, movies, TV, there were more sort of avenues or platforms for young people to see their culture or to sort of express what they liked, or to tune in to the stuff that they liked. So again, that's a part of the story, right? Is the role that youth culture, the role that music and other aspects of whatever we want to call it, if it's pop culture, youth culture, the stuff that Connie's into, largely expressed through the music, that almost plays a sort of an active role in this narrative. And it says a lot about Connie. And later, again, Arnold's using that same music, those same sort of cultural markers, showing how they can be manipulated and used for really evil ends. So some people think this kind of exposes the dark side of youth culture, or the dark side of the counterculture that is often associated with the 1960s. Young people sort of rejecting their parents' way of life and, experimenting with drugs and, the different kinds of politics, different kinds of social views, listening to rock music, all of that. But there often was, sort of a dark side to that. And perhaps that's what we're getting here. So there's a lot we could explore with social context, and we could sort of choose our angle. We could treat this story kind of as a ripped from the headlines, sort of based on true events, and really pursue the Schmid angle. Or we could maybe think a little bit more abstractly and get more invested in the music angle and think a little bit more about Bob Dylan, think about that one song in particular, think about other popular music of the 60s, and that could also give us some really good results. All right, so if we're thinking about genre, it's kind of a difficult story to classify. I would say it starts out, again, sort of feeling like a coming-of-age story, then maybe it shifts into a thriller, then it becomes maybe just a straight horror story, with an ending that does not seem to bode well for our protagonist. So, kind of a difficult one, but I think it borrows certain elements from horror. And I think it does that intentionally, especially as we reach the climax and the resolution. Some people might consider it a sort of cautionary tale. Others might just look at it as a straight thriller, sort of suspense tale. You guys can sort of decide. And then if we're thinking about social relevance, this is always a way, again, to generate some larger ideas, some more big picture thoughts that you could pursue in the future. And this is always just sort of a matter of connecting the theme of the text to something in the real world. So we can probably do that here. I mean, there's certainly a commentary here, I think, about power dynamics, sexual assault, the way teen girls might be sexualized in certain ways, the way they are potentially preyed upon by other elements of society. Again, we could think once again about youth culture, and does it always influence young people in the right ways? I mean, it really just depends on our perspective and how we view the story. But certainly there's real world concerns that are present today that this story touches on or perhaps speaks to directly. And we could uncover that. We could just ask the question, how does the meaning, or maybe a larger message at work here, impact readers? What's the real world impact? How does this affect us as we read? Will this story change minds? Will this story open eyes? Will this story make people have a new perspective, think differently about issues of power, issues of sexual violence? Like, what is this story doing? I always encourage people to think about works of literature as active things. They are doing things in the world. Don't just regard them as passive objects. This is really what the social relevance angle is all about. They're not just things to look at. They're not just, like a nice piece of decoration. They are active. They are accomplishing things. They are doing things. Of course, we can debate, right? We might, say that some texts aren't really doing anything, and then others are, and that might be part of how we attach value to the literature that we read. What is this stuff really doing? What kind of impact does it really have? And I think often in our culture, if we can identify real social impact, that usually makes us feel better or more favorably towards a work of literature, when we can really see that it's having an effect on people in the real world. And some argue that it's harder for literature to do that today, but that's certainly an ongoing debate. All right, so I don't think we need to run through all of that for A Good Man is Hard to Find, not together, but I would like you guys to do so individually. And you don't necessarily have to try every single strategy that I've gone through, but try a few. Think about context. Think about conflict. Think about social relevance. If you can just check off a few of these, you're going to generate some material. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about genre in relation to O'Connor, because we can do, I think, a little bit more with genre when it comes to A Good Man is Hard to Find. So most of the fiction produced by Flannery O'Connor is classified as Southern Gothic. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this, not because we need to be experts about the Southern Gothic genre, but because this is an example of something that you might want to dig into a little bit more and can easily find information on through some quick research online. So there's a lot of online sort of literary encyclopedias. Even Wikipedia has pages on a lot of these literary terms. So you can always find out more. If you don't really know much about the genre, if you're kind of new to it, you can always dig into it a little bit more, because that's often going to be important, especially if a lot of the author's work is sort of considered to be in this genre, or if a particular text is held up as sort of a classic example of a particular type of genre. So Southern Gothic is very specific, but we're all kind of familiar with it because we see elements of it quite a bit. You guys probably know a little bit about Gothic just as a larger genre that really was imported from Europe. You know, scary castles, often supernatural elements, sort of fantastical things. So the Gothic romance was a very popular genre going all the way back to the 1700s. It sort of comes over to America and changes a little bit. And, you know, in America, we don't have the sort of ancient family curses and ancestral castles that you find in Europe. So what happens to the Gothic in the US, and if you've taken my 451, you've already heard this, but the Gothic becomes a lot more rooted in nature. The forests and mountains and swamps of America are sort of vast geography. So that's kind of important to keep in mind. But so that's the Gothic, and it was often attached to, you know, sort of spooky stories, often involving some kind of supernatural or fantastical element. But the Southern Gothic is a little bit more specific, but in a general sense, it can just be thought of as any Gothic tale that takes place in the South, set in the South, as this particular story is, and all of O'Connor's stories were. She was from Georgia. Most of her fiction is set in Georgia. But also the Southern Gothic as a genre is really characterized by certain kinds of characters and certain kinds of events. So we're often going to see grotesque characters, sort of macabre things happening, in some cases fantastical elements like traditional Gothic. But yeah, there's a certain dark side of psychology, human psychology, that might be explored in a lot of these works. And a lot of Southern writers are associated with the genre. So, you know, William Faulkner, Carson McCullers, and Flannery O'Connor is another one that often gets mentioned. But if we're thinking about those grotesque characters, there's kind of two levels on which we can consider them. On one level, we can think of the word grotesque in more or less its literal sense as being something that's kind of monstrous or malformed or abnormal, strange in some way. And that's true of many of O'Connor's characters. They're a little bit off-kilter, strange, but also in a strictly literary sense, the grotesque is often thought of as being sort of human characters that are exaggerated in some ways. But again, very much abnormal, off-kilter, and sometimes grotesque is compared to the uncanny, another term that's often lumped in with the Gothic. The uncanny is when something feels a little bit familiar, but also unfamiliar at the same time. Like seeing somebody who maybe looks familiar, but you don't know them. Or something that feels like maybe you've experienced it before, but it's different. So that weird combination of the familiar and the unfamiliar. And the grotesque is a little bit like that in terms of characters. These are people, these are recognizable people, and they are familiar types of people in some ways. But they're also exaggerated, and they're often monstrous in some way, whether that's manifested externally or in some cases it's more of an internal thing. So these are important just ideas to have in mind. These are important, concepts to sort of know when we're jumping into that text. This is why genre really does matter sometimes, especially if it's a very specific genre that has certain character types, certain tones and registers that it's known for, because knowing a little bit about those genre characteristics will obviously help you to understand the specific text that you're reading that week. So I just wanted to fill you in a little bit. But again, you could just Google Southern Gothic and find a lot of good stuff. Not all of what you find would be necessarily reputable sources that you could use on a research paper, but just for your own edification, your own knowledge. You could find a lot of definitions, a lot of additional background info that could just broaden your own understanding of what the Southern Gothic is and why this particular short story is an example of it. And that can help fuel your own analysis. Okay, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about our first analytical response assignment. It is due at the end of week 4. So I just wanted to remind you guys of a few things. If you took My 203, you might remember that we talked about some different types of writing that we can do in an English class, particularly a lit class. And we've already kind of moved beyond some of these things, but we can always summarize. We can always just do a sort of initial emotional response. We're pretty familiar with those types of writing, and we're doing those kinds of responses on the discussion board largely. And summaries, at this level, I'm not going to ask you to submit summaries to me, but summarizing is still a pretty useful tool. You can do it along with sort of your annotations if you're taking notes as you read. It's never a bad idea to jot down a brief summary after you've finished reading a text, or at the very least, perhaps to find one. They're never hard to find on the internet. Again, don't use those summaries on your later papers. Don't view them as future sources. They are just tools that you're using to further your own understanding after you've read something. Particularly if you have questions, if you're not clear on something, you can always, consult other sources. I can't stop you. I think we sometimes do it too quickly, but that's always an option for you. But you should always have a summary on hand, either one written by you or one that you can consult, just so you make sure that you're clear on all the big plot points and you have a grasp on the story. But at this level, you're not going to need to turn summaries into me. And most of our emotional responses will be recorded in our reading journals or maybe on the discussion board. So that really just leaves a couple of writing styles that we're going to be pursuing in our formal assignments. So clearly for us, the name of the game is analysis. And we're going to be doing analysis really throughout the entire semester. So we have 3 of these short analytical papers, but I threw the word response in there as well because you are still responding, and I wanted to remind you guys that it is still opinion based and you are still free to pursue your own interpretations, but analysis for us is going to be argumentative and it's going to be original. So that means it's never enough to just summarize. It's never enough to just offer observations like we might do at that initial responding level. We have to push a little deeper. Remember, I think we talked about this in week 1. Remember what it means to analyze. You're simply taking something apart, examining its individual parts or elements, and then reassembling it in order to demonstrate how it works. So, speaking figuratively, that is what we do with works of literature. We take them apart, we examine individual parts, whether it be characters, metaphors, certain patterns that we find, whatever. And then by examining those different parts, we arrive at an interpretation. We arrive at some original conclusions that we can put forth in an argumentative fashion. We're going to have evidence that we draw from the text. Textual evidence, textual support is always important. But as long as we can substantiate our claims, We can have a valid argument. It's fine if others don't agree. It's fine if I don't share that interpretation or if a classmate does not. As long as you are sort of making the right kinds of moves and finding evidence in the text, you'll be in good shape. So this is a little bit, of an adventure, perhaps for some, but just remember, I will provide a lot of detailed feedback. So, take some chances, generate some original thought, and if you go astray, if you have some issues, if there are some areas where you need to work a little bit more, or you need to kind of improve, I'll be able to give you some guidance, and we can always work together more in the future. But just a couple of tips, think about how and why questions. Those are good ways to start analysis. How and why. Okay, why are certain things happening, or why is the author doing certain things? And then how does the author achieve certain effects or accomplish certain goals, or maybe express certain aspects of theme? So by answering those kinds of questions, you can usually arrive at some good conclusions. And also, don't forget about our old literary elements. You can always dig into character, you can always dig into conflict. That's a big part of plot, and how plots typically get developed. You can jump into settings. You can jump into more sort of verbal elements. You can be more focused on imagery or figurative language or certain symbols. But you can also pick out a particular change or a particular conflict, and then when you dig deeper, you can find even more there, more to say about characters, more to say about setting or social context. You can get a lot of mileage out of social context as well, as long as you're relating it back to specific elements in the text. So there's a lot of options. What you have to do is find the stuff that's interesting to you. We often refer to these as like through lines or entry points. So once you've selected the text that you're going to write about, you have to just find the stuff that you're interested in within that text. Okay, it's really no more complicated than that. What's grabbing you? A particular character, a particular trope, something that you notice in other examples of that genre that you can track and talk about. What's grabbing you? What element? What device? I just rattled off a bunch of examples. Pick something, a couple of things. Maybe have them be related. And those are going to be your ways in. By examining those particular elements, or these could even be concepts, right? Ideas, recurring features. They don't always have to be classified as a literary element, but just find the stuff you care about, the stuff that you're interested in. And then you're inside the text. Now you're giving us examples, you're quoting, you're giving us specific textual support, you're developing your ideas, and that's how you can eventually arrive at analysis. So that would be my advice. Try to have some fun with it. It is sort of at its core a little bit of a creative activity. We're not creating literature, of course, but it's about finding your angle. It's about finding your way in. What do you have to offer? Think about it that way. What is your contribution? Every text that we read in this class has been read by many others, has been studied and written about by other students, other interpretations, other conclusions about all of these texts, particularly really famous ones like these that we're talking about today. Plenty of people have already contributed ideas, interpretations. Now you do the same. It's not enough to just repeat what other people have said. You have to bring something new. You have to produce something original. That's how we join these larger critical conversations. And we'll talk more about that later. But the first step is to conduct analysis. That's the first step to joining bigger conversations and to, producing something original. And it's not easy. There's no one way to do it, but you have to engage closely with the text. You have to read the text that you're going to write about. I would recommend reading it multiple times. You need notes on that text. You need to have some passages, some examples from that text that you want to use in your in your short paper, some stuff that you can use as quotes, as evidence. You need to get organized. You need to find the elements that you want to focus on, and you need to make an original argument. Your argument or your thesis is your interpretation, and it needs to be clear to your readers. So if you have questions, any last minute stuff that you want to talk about, email me. We can always set up a video conference. I'm always available to, well, not at any time, but I'm available usually on Thursdays, Fridays, maybe Tuesdays. We can find the time. Just talk to me and let me know if you have questions or concerns. Okay? And I'll see you next week.